Max had always been fascinated by the unknown. As a seasoned explorer with a reputation for uncovering secrets hidden beneath the surface of the earth, he was no stranger to treacherous journeys. But nothing could have prepared him for what lay beneath the modern world. A city forgotten by time, left untouched for centuries. It was in a small, quiet town on the outskirts of the Appalachian Mountains where Max received an old, tattered map. The map, given to him by a mysterious historian who claimed to know the forgotten history of the land, promised to lead to a hidden city buried deep beneath the Earth's surface. The townspeople whispered of the place, the forgotten city beneath, and spoke of its history, a history that had been buried along with its people. But there was one thing that terrified Max more than the rumors. The city had never been fully abandoned. The inhabitants hadn't just died, they had evolved. Max wasn't one to believe in local folklore, but something about the map pulled him in. There was an undeniable allure to the unknown, the thrill of discovering something so ancient, so mysterious, that the world had forgotten it ever existed. Without hesitation, Max packed his gear, flashlight, rope, compass, and set off for the cave entrance marked on the map. His companion, Ellie, a fellow adventurer with a keen sense of logic, joined him. She wasn't easily convinced by superstitions, but her expertise in archaeological digs made her the perfect partner for this expedition. The entrance was hidden beneath a thick layer of vines and moss, almost as if nature itself had conspired to keep the city secret. The cave's mouth was narrow, barely wide enough to allow Max and Ellie to squeeze through. But beyond the entrance, a massive chamber opened up, its ceiling lost in shadows. A cold wind swept through the cave, carrying with it the scent of earth and something ancient. Max shone his flashlight down the darkened path, his beam cutting through the darkness, revealing jagged rock formations and walls adorned with strange carvings. "Look at this," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. She knelt beside the wall, tracing a set of symbols etched into the stone. They were unlike anything she had seen before, foreign and almost otherworldly. Max leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. "What do you think they mean?" Ellie frowned. "I'm not sure, but these symbols don't belong here. Whoever carved these wasn't just passing through. They were trying to communicate something. The deeper they ventured, the colder it became. The walls of the cave seemed to close in on them, narrowing with every step." Ellie paused, glancing behind them. "Max, do you hear that?" Max stopped in his tracks. The faintest of sounds echoed through the cave, scraping, shifting, like something moving in the shadows. He turned, sweeping his flashlight over the darkened path. There was nothing. "I don't hear anything," Max replied, trying to shake off the creeping unease that gnawed at him. But Ellie's eyes were wide, her body tense. "I swear I heard something. Maybe it's just the wind." "Yeah, maybe," Max said, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They continued their descent deeper into the cave, until the narrow path opened up into a vast underground chamber. The size of the room took them both by surprise. Its enormity seemed impossible, stretching far beyond the reach of their flashlights. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for what must have been centuries. But as they stepped further into the room, they noticed something strange, odd markings on the floor. "Those aren't natural," Ellie said, her voice trembling slightly. The markings were in the shape of concentric circles, and they were arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Max bent down to examine them, his fingers brushing over the rough surface. "What are they?" "I don't know, but they don't look like anything I've ever seen." As they continued to explore the room, the air grew heavier, thicker with the scent of damp stone and decaying history. Ellie stopped suddenly, her eyes widening in shock. She pointed to the far corner of the room. Max turned to follow her gaze. There, partially obscured by shadows, was a massive stone archway, half buried under the weight of centuries of dust and debris. It was ornately carved, its surface covered in symbols that mirrored the ones on the walls. Something about it felt wrong. Max approached cautiously, his heart racing. This must be the entrance to the city. Ellie hesitated. Are we sure we should go any further? Something doesn't feel right. Max turned to her, his face set with determination. This is what we came here for. The city is right behind that door. Ellie, we have to see it. Ellie's eyes darted nervously around the chamber, but she nodded. Fine, but let's be careful. Together, they began clearing away the debris in front of the archway. As they moved the last of the rubble, the door creaked open with an eerie groan. Beyond the threshold lay a staircase, spiraling downward into an abyss of darkness. Max stood at the edge, peering into the shadows. There was no sound, no echo of footsteps or distant murmurs, just the oppressive silence of the forgotten world below. He took a deep breath and began to descend, Ellie close behind him. With each step, the temperature seemed to drop. The walls of the staircase were slick with moisture, and an unsettling chill crawled up their spines. As they reached the bottom, the air thickened, almost as though it were alive, pressing in on them, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. At the bottom of the stairs was a long hallway, its walls lined with towering statues, figures that appeared human but were grotesque, twisted into unnatural shapes. Their eyes seemed to follow them as they walked, their stony faces contorted into expressions of agony and despair. Max felt a chill run through him. This place, it feels like it's alive, Ellie muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Max didn't reply. He was too busy scanning the room, his flashlight flicking over every corner, every dark recess. And then he saw it. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin. It stood at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light. Its back was turned, but there was no mistaking the chilling presence of something that should not have been there. Max's breath caught in his throat. Ellie, did you see that? Before she could answer, the figure turned. And that's when the scream pierced the silence. Max's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he was frozen. The figure at the end of the hallway stood motionless, its elongated silhouette a stark contrast to the gloom surrounding it. Ellie, standing just behind him, gasped, and Max could hear the shallow tremor in her breath. Who is that? Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible over the thunderous pounding in Max's ears. Max didn't answer. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was unnaturally tall, with arms that seemed too long for its body. Its head was low, almost as if it were examining the ground, but something about it seemed wrong, too still, too deliberate. Max squinted, trying to get a clearer look, but the figure remained just beyond the reach of their flashlight's beam. Suddenly, the figure moved. It wasn't a slow, cautious step. It was a lunge, a terrifying burst of motion. Max barely had time to react before the creature surged forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally as if it were closing the distance in an instant. Ellie screamed, but Max grabbed her arm, pulling her backward toward the stairs. No, we need to get out of here, Max shouted, his voice strained with fear. But the air around them seemed to thicken, and Max felt as if something was pushing him back. The stone walls of the hallway closed in, and the stifling silence was broken only by their hurried breathing. They scrambled up the stairs, but as they reached the top, the air grew heavier. The stairs seemed to extend forever, the dim light from their flashlights flickering wildly. Max turned around, half expecting to see the figure right behind them. But when he looked, there was nothing. only the oppressive darkness that swallowed the lower chambers. He exhaled shakily. It's gone. But where did it go? Ellie shook her head, her face pale. That thing wasn't human, Max. What the hell was that? Max didn't have an answer. His mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. He'd seen creatures in old ruins before, monsters conjured by the shadows of forgotten civilizations. But this was different. This wasn't some ancient legend brought to life. This was something real, something that had been lurking in the dark for centuries. They stood in silence for a moment, catching their breath, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and Max could feel the oppressive atmosphere seeping into his bones. "We need to keep going," Max said, his voice steadier than he felt. "There has to be more to this city. There has to be an answer." Ellie didn't look convinced. "Max, are you sure? That thing, whatever it wasn't human. And the carvings, the symbols, none of this makes sense. I don't know if we should keep going down there." Max stared at the staircase, the swirling darkness below. Something deep inside him urged him to press forward, to discover the truth no matter how terrifying. He couldn't let fear stop him now, not when they were so close to uncovering the forgotten city's secrets. "We have to know what's down there," Max said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Ellie or himself. "We need to understand what happened to the people who lived here." Ellie hesitated, her gaze flickering between the pitch-black depths of the cave and Max's determined face. After a long moment, she nodded. "Okay, but if anything else happens, Max, we're leaving." No questions asked. Max nodded, the knot of unease tightening in his chest. Agreed. Together, they descended the stairs once more, the atmosphere growing colder with each step. The silence was broken only by the faint sound of their footsteps echoing through the cavern. As they reached the bottom, the hallway stretched out before them once again, long and empty, as if it had been waiting for them. Max's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing more of the grotesque statues lining the walls. Their hollow eyes seemed to follow their every move, and Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something ancient and powerful was waiting just beyond their sight. They continued down the hallway, their hearts pounding with every step. The walls seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing deeper, more malevolent. And then, just as they reached the end of the hall, Max's flashlight flickered and went out. "Max!" The light, Ellie's voice broke off in panic. Max quickly shook the flashlight, but it refused to turn back on. His pulse quickened, the darkness now closing in around them. I don't understand," Max muttered, fumbling with the flashlight. It was working just fine. Ellie's breathing was shallow, her face pale. "Max, we need to get out of here. Now!" But before Max could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled. A low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, vibrating the very air around them. The walls seemed to tremble, as if the city itself were awakening from a long slumber. And then, from the darkness ahead, a whisper, soft at first, like a breath on the wind, grew louder, clearer. "Leave, now." Max froze, the blood draining from his face. Ellie looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror. The voice came again, closer this time, low, rasping, full of malice. "Leave or die." The whisper seemed to come from all directions, swirling around them like a storm. Max's mind raced, but before he could say anything, the walls began to pulse, alive, breathing, as if the very stones were in tune with the voice. The ground shifted beneath their feet, and then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the same tall, thin creature they had seen earlier, but this time its face was visible. a grotesque mass of twisted features, half human, half something else entirely. Its eyes were black, hollow pits, empty of any soul. Max's stomach twisted in fear. He opened his mouth to shout, but no words came out. The creature stepped forward, its skeletal hand reaching out toward them. And then, with a bone-chilling screech, it lunged. Max's heart thundered in his chest, the creature's elongated fingers just inches from him. Ellie screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him back, but the ground beneath their feet was uneven, and they stumbled. The air around them grew colder, the temperature plummeting as if the creature's presence had sucked all warmth from the room. The creature's jaw snapped open wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Its hollow eyes locked onto Max, and for a fleeting moment, he felt as if his very soul was being pulled into the depths of those black pits. It wasn't just a monster, it was something ancient, something that had been waiting for this very moment. Max's mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't respond. Time seemed to stretch, the creature's clawed hand reaching for him, its body lurching forward in a violent motion. "Max!" Ellie's voice cut through the fog of terror that clouded his senses. She yanked him hard, her grip fierce. "Move!" The sudden pull snapped Max out of his trance-like state. He instinctively lunged backward, dragging Ellie with him. The creature's claws missed them by a hair's breadth, the air between them thick with the stench of decay. It hissed in frustration, a sound like the scraping of metal on stone. Max and Ellie scrambled backward, their feet sliding on the damp stone floor. The creature lunged again, but this time they were ready. Max slammed into the stone wall, trying to put distance between them and the monster, his mind racing. "Why won't it stop?" Ellie cried, her face pale with terror. Max didn't have an answer. His pulse raced as he searched for an escape route. The hallway they were in was a dead end. There was nowhere to go. The only way out was the path behind the creature, but that was impossible. There was no way they could get past it. The creature's twisted body contorted as it moved, its limbs elongating unnaturally, like something out of a nightmare. Its face twisted in a grotesque grin, and it began to crawl toward them, each movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Max could feel the walls closing in. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his mind raced. They had to fight back, but with what? There was nothing here, just the cold stone and their own fear. "Ellie, we have to go back to the stairs," Max said, his voice tight with panic. "We can't stay here." Ellie shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't outrun that thing. It's too fast." Max didn't have a better plan, but staying in the hallway wasn't an option. The creature's screeching hiss echoed off the walls, sending a cold shiver down his spine. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, a sound that seemed to vibrate through his bones. "Max, it's coming closer," Ellie shouted. Max grabbed her hand, his grip tight. "We don't have a choice. Run." Without thinking, they bolted down the hallway, the creature's movements fast behind them. Max's mind was a blur of panic, but his body moved on autopilot. The stairs were still a few feet away, but with every step, the creature seemed to get closer. Its breathing was ragged, and the sound of its claws scraping against the stone was deafening. Max's flashlight flickered again, casting wild shadows on the walls. Every corner seemed to hide something, lurking, waiting. The very air felt alive with malice, and he could feel the weight of the forgotten city pressing down on them, like it was holding them in place, making every movement feel slower, heavier. Ellie stumbled, but Max caught her arm just in time. He could feel her trembling, the fear that was radiating off her as she gasped for breath. We can't keep running like this," she panted. "It's too fast." Max didn't know what to say. They were running out of options, and the creature's pursuit showed no signs of slowing. It was relentless, like it had all the time in the world to hunt them down. Suddenly, a loud, deafening crash echoed from the floor above them, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. The creature stopped in its tracks, its head snapping upward, as if listening for something. It hissed, a low, guttural sound, and then it turned. Its attention shifted. Max took the opportunity to pull Ellie toward the stairs. "Now, we have to go." They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled up the stairs as quickly as they could, the echo of their footsteps deafening in the silence. The creature's movements had slowed, but its presence still loomed, like a dark shadow waiting just beyond their reach. As they reached the top of the stairs, Max turned, expecting to see the creature right behind them. But when he looked back, the hallway below was empty. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted slightly, though Max still felt an unsettling chill in the air. The creature was gone, but Max didn't trust the silence. "Where did it go?" Ellie asked, her voice shaky. Max's gaze remained fixed on the bottom of the stairs. He didn't know. All he knew was that whatever this thing was, it was far from done with them. The Forgotten City, this place, had its own rules, and they had yet to uncover even a fraction of its dark secrets. "We need to get out of here," Max said, his voice grim. But as they moved toward the entrance, they were stopped by another sound, the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. It was too soft to hear clearly, but the words were unmistakable. "Not yet." Max froze. Ellie's eyes widened in fear. The voice came from deeper within the city, deeper than they had ever gone before, and Max knew with a sickening certainty that they hadn't even scratched the surface of the horror that awaited them. Max couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as if every shadow, every corner, and every creaking floorboard held something waiting to reach out for them. The whisper had been faint, but it had carried an undeniable sense of malevolence. And now, with the creature seemingly gone, an unsettling silence filled the air. It was a silence that pressed in on them, a silence that made Max's skin crawl. He turned to Ellie, his voice low and urgent. "We need to keep moving. We're not safe here." Ellie nodded, but she didn't speak. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was barely holding it together, and Max could see it. She was terrified, and so was he, but he couldn't let her see how badly it was affecting him. They had to focus, survive. The hallway they had ascended into felt cold, the air thick with the musty smell of old stone and dust, the remnants of something ancient, long forgotten. Max couldn't help but wonder, how long had the city been here? What had happened to its inhabitants? The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up, and the more unsettling everything seemed. Max led the way, his flashlight shaking in his hand as he cast a beam across the dark corridor ahead. The walls seemed to close in on them with every step, the faintest traces of something. Some movement, perhaps, just out of view. He could feel the weight of the place pressing on him, suffocating him with its dark secrets. "We're not alone here," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Max didn't answer. There was no need. He felt it too. They were being followed, not by the creature, but by something more insidious. The air was thick with it. He could feel it brushing against the back of his neck, a presence lurking just out of sight. They had only just begun to scratch the surface of whatever horrors this city held, and already it felt like the walls were closing in around them. They walked in silence, each step echoing loudly in the vast, oppressive space. Every so often, Max's flashlight would flicker, casting strange, distorted shadows along the walls. Ellie seemed to sense the same unease that Max felt. She was looking over her shoulder every few seconds, her footsteps quickening as though she were afraid to be left behind. "Do you hear that?" Ellie asked suddenly, her voice tight with panic. Max stopped dead in his tracks. He listened. At first, there was nothing but the distant creaking of old wood and the scurrying of rats or insects. But then, just for a moment, he heard it too. A low, guttural sound. It was coming from behind them. Max's pulse quickened. "We need to move faster," he said, his voice low but firm. They weren't alone. Whatever was here with them was getting closer. And it wasn't human. They broke into a run, their footsteps thundering through the narrow corridor. The flashlight bounced wildly in Max's hand, casting fleeting glimpses of the dark, crumbling walls around them. Ellie was right behind him, her breath ragged as she fought to keep up. They didn't speak, didn't dare look back. All that mattered now was escape. Max's mind raced. He couldn't help but think back to the whispers, the voices they had heard before. What were they? Who were they? He had to find answers, but the weight of this place, the heavy, suffocating darkness, was starting to feel like it would swallow him whole. They came to a small chamber, the walls lined with strange carvings. Runes, symbols that Max didn't recognize. The air was colder here, colder than it had been before. He could see his breath misting in the dim light, and his hands were shaking from more than just the cold. There was something about this room, something wrong. Ellie stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the symbols. "Max, what are these?" Max shook his head. "I don't know, but I don't think we should stay here." As if on cue, a sudden, sharp noise broke the silence. A door creaking opened somewhere deep within the chamber. Both of them froze. Max turned to Ellie. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear, and he could see that she was trying to stay calm. But he knew she was just as terrified as he was. They couldn't stay in this room. Not with whatever had opened that door coming their way. "Let's go," Max whispered, grabbing her arm. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A figure standing motionless in the far corner of the room. Max's heart skipped a beat. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. The figure was tall, its body obscured in the shadows, but Max could make out the faint outline of a gaunt face, pale and sunken, with eyes that were too wide, too black. It was staring at them. No, not staring. It was waiting. Max's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, as if some invisible force had gripped him. Ellie grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "Max, what are you doing?" But it was too late. The figure moved. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something twisted. Something that had been lurking in the shadows of this forsaken city for God knows how long. The figure's limbs stretched unnaturally, and its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Max could hear the blood rushing in his ears as he finally wrenched himself from his stupor. "Run," he shouted, and they bolted for the door. They didn't dare look back. The thing lunged. Max and Ellie reached the door just as the figure's claws scraped the stone floor, a sound that echoed like a death knell in the otherwise silent chamber. They stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind them, and pressed their backs against it, panting and shaking. But they couldn't relax. The air was thick with dread. The thing was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next move. Max and Ellie didn't speak. There was no need. They both knew the truth. The forgotten city beneath them had just begun to reveal its true horrors. Max's heart hammered in his chest. His breath was shallow, ragged, and his hands were slick with sweat as they pressed against the cold stone door, holding it shut. The faint scratching noises from the other side sent a shiver down his spine. Whatever that creature was, it was relentless, and it wasn't giving up. Ellie was panting beside him, her face pale and drawn. She was barely holding it together, her eyes darting around, searching for an escape that didn't seem to exist. "We can't stay here," Max whispered urgently, his voice hoarse. His mind was racing. There had to be another way out. They couldn't go back the way they came. That thing would be waiting for them. Ellie nodded, her teeth clenched as she fought to control the fear that threatened to take over. "But where do we go? This place, it's like a maze." Max glanced around, his flashlight illuminating the narrow corridor that stretched out before them. The walls were damp and covered in strange symbols, the same runes they had seen earlier. But these symbols looked different, almost as though they were shifting, changing as if alive. The air felt oppressive, like the city itself was watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. Max turned back to Ellie, his face grim. "We keep moving. We can't stop." Reluctantly, Ellie agreed, her face pale but determined. "Okay, let's go." They began walking, their footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. With each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more suffocating. It wasn't just the city that was alive. Something else was here with them. Something that had been waiting for them, drawing them deeper into the labyrinthine depths of the forgotten city. Max's thoughts were racing. He couldn't shake the image of that creature. Its eyes, black and lifeless, staring at him from the shadows. It had been so close, too close, and now, as they ventured further into the bowels of the city, Max felt an overwhelming sense of dread. They passed through more winding tunnels, each one colder and darker than the last. The air grew thicker, the smell of decay and dampness more pronounced. Max's flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls, making the strange carvings seem even more sinister. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a large, cavernous room. The ceiling was high above them, lost in the darkness, and the walls were lined with stone pillars, each one marked with more of those unsettling symbols. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, a stone altar of sorts, with strange carvings etched into its surface. Ellie stepped forward, drawn to the pedestal. She reached out a trembling hand to touch it, but Max grabbed her wrist, pulling her back. "No," he said firmly. "Don't touch anything." Ellie recoiled, her eyes wide with fear. "But why? What is this place?" Max didn't know. He couldn't make sense of it all. But something about the altar, something about the way it seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, terrified him. He had a feeling that if they disturbed anything here, they would never make it out alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled, a low rumble vibrating through the stone floor. Max stumbled, his hand gripping the nearest pillar for support. The rumbling grew louder, more intense, until it felt as though the very foundations of the city were shaking. "What is that?" Ellie shouted, her voice filled with panic. Before Max could answer, the room went dark. The flashlight flickered and died, leaving them in total darkness. Panic surged through Max's chest as he fumbled for his spare batteries, his heart pounding in his ears. Ellie grabbed his arm, her grip tight and desperate. "We're not alone, Max," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but he could hear the terror in it. Max managed to get the new batteries into the flashlight, and the beam of light cut through the blackness, revealing nothing. The room was empty, save for the pedestal and the strange symbols on the walls. But something was wrong. The darkness felt heavier now, thicker, as if it had a presence of its own. Max felt as though the very air around them was alive, pressing in on them from all sides. He tried to steady his breathing, but it was impossible. His chest tightened, and his heart raced as the room seemed to close in on him. Then a whisper. It was faint, barely audible at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. Max strained to hear it, his eyes darting around the room, searching for its source. It sounded like a voice, soft, almost melodic, but there was something off about it. It was the voice of someone who had been lost for too long. The whisper turned into a chant, and Max's blood ran cold as the words began to form in his mind. He couldn't understand them, but the language, ancient, twisted, sent a chill through him. It was the same language as the symbols, the same language that had been etched into the walls of this forsaken city. Ellie clutched his arm, her breath quick and shallow. "Max, I don't like this. We need to get out of here. Now." But it was too late. The room began to shift, the walls closing in around them, and the ground trembled again, stronger this time. Max could feel the vibrations through his entire body. His flashlight flickered, and in that moment he caught a glimpse of something in the shadows. A figure. It was tall, too tall, its limbs elongated and twisted, its face obscured by darkness. The eyes gleamed, bright and unblinking, as it stepped closer, emerging from the shadows. Max's breath caught in his throat as the creature loomed in front of them. Ellie screamed, but Max was frozen. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth. And then, everything went black. Max woke to the sound of his heart pounding in his ears, the rapid beats pushing against the stillness of the dark. The cold, clammy sensation of stone against his back was the first thing he noticed, followed by the bone-chilling realization that he wasn't where he had been moments before. His mind swam with confusion. What had happened? Where was he? He tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He felt like he was trapped in a thick haze, unable to summon enough strength to move. The weight of the darkness pressed on him, suffocating him, as though the very air was alive with an ancient malice. Max's eyes fluttered open, struggling to adjust to the oppressive gloom surrounding him. The dim light of his flashlight flickered weakly nearby, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Ellie, she had to be here too. She had to be. Ellie? Max croaked, his voice hoarse, barely audible. His throat felt dry, as if he hadn't spoken in days. He forced himself to sit up, his hands pushing against the ground, but there was no sign of her. Panic surged in his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He couldn't see her anywhere. The room he was in was vast, far larger than the one they had just fled from. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with a sickening metallic smell that seemed to cling to everything. Max grabbed the flashlight, forcing himself to his feet. He had to find Ellie. He had to make sure she was okay. His hands trembled as he swept the beam of light across the cavernous room. The walls were smooth, slick with moisture, and covered in the same twisted symbols. There were no windows, no doors that he could see, just the endless expanse of cold stone, stretching out into the shadows. And then he saw it, a figure, at the far end of the room. In the dim light, a shadowed shape shifted. It was tall, far too tall for any human, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a void of darkness, a patch of emptiness in the form of a man. The same creature from before. Max's breath caught in his throat as his heart skipped a beat. It was moving toward him, slowly, methodically, as if it knew he was helpless, knew he had no choice but to stay. His mind raced, trying to piece together the horror that had unfolded. Had the creature dragged him here? Had it somehow separated him from Ellie? He had no answers, only fear. Pure, unrelenting fear. With a surge of adrenaline, Max turned, searching for an escape. He had no idea where to go, but the instinct to survive kicked in, and he began running. The flashlight's beam wavered as he sprinted through the room, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick stone beneath him. But the creature's footsteps were not. They were heavy, unyielding. They echoed behind him, growing closer with each passing second. Max didn't dare look back. He just kept running, his pulse racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the room seemed endless, stretching on, and no matter how fast he ran, the creature's presence was always just behind him, closer than before. He reached a corner, rounding it, but his foot slipped, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his shoulder as he hit the stone floor, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He scrambled to his feet, desperate to get away, but the creature was there. Max spun around, the flashlight catching a glimpse of the creature's grotesque form. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were bright, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. They bore into him an unspoken message of pure hunger, a hunger that only one thing could satisfy, and that one thing was him. He backed away, his chest tight with fear, but the creature advanced, its movements slow but deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Max's eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, that could help him escape. But there was nothing. No weapons, no doors, no windows, nothing. Max's legs trembled beneath him as the creature drew closer, its shadow growing larger with each passing second. He was trapped. He was going to die here, in this forgotten city beneath the earth, alone. But then, just as the creature was about to strike, a sound interrupted the tension. A scream. Max's blood ran cold as the scream echoed through the room. It was a voice familiar, panicked. Ellie. She was somewhere nearby. She was still alive. With renewed determination, Max turned and bolted toward the sound. His legs screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop. He had to find her. He had to save her. The creature's footsteps followed, relentless, but Max didn't look back. His flashlight bobbed as he ran, the beam cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. The closer he got to the sound, the clearer it became. Ellie was in trouble. She was close, and then he saw her. She was standing in the center of a large chamber, her back against the stone wall. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face pale, and her hands were trembling at her sides. In front of her stood another figure. Another creature similar to the one that had chased Max earlier, but this one was different. Its body was hunched over, its skin a sickly shade of gray, and its eyes, those eyes, glowed with a malevolent hunger. It was staring at Ellie, its mouth opening and closing as if it were tasting the air, savoring her scent. "No!" Max shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. Ellie turned toward him, her eyes filled with relief, but before she could say anything, the creature lunged. Max's heart hammered in his chest as the creature lunged toward Ellie. His legs moved before his mind could process the danger. He had to reach her. He couldn't let it take her. Not now. Ellie screamed, stumbling backward. Her body pressed against the cold stone wall as the creature's jagged claws slashed through the air. It was massive, its limbs contorted in grotesque, unnatural angles, and its eyes gleamed with that same malicious hunger. Max didn't think, he acted. He grabbed a sharp stone from the ground, feeling its weight in his hand as he hurled himself toward the creature. The rock hit its side with a sickening thud, but the creature didn't even flinch. It spun toward Max, its dark, hollow eyes narrowing as it let out a guttural growl. The creature's gaze shifted back to Ellie, its mouth opening wide in a predatory grin. Max's pulse raced. He couldn't let it hurt her. He couldn't let it take her. "Ellie, run!" Max shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But Ellie didn't move. Frozen in place, her body trembling with terror, Ellie was unable to move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the creature. It was like the darkness had claimed her, like she was trapped in some twisted, unbreakable spell. "Ellie!" Max shouted again, more urgently this time. He charged forward, but the creature was faster. It turned its full attention on him, its claws slashing out with terrifying speed. Max barely dodged in time, the creature's claws grazing his arm and leaving a bloody trail in their wake. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. Ellie had to escape. She had to. With every ounce of his strength, Max pushed past the pain and launched himself toward the creature once more. He swung the stone in his hand, aiming for its face, but the creature caught his arm in midair, its grip like iron. Max's vision blurred with pain as the creature's claws dug into his flesh, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. He gasped for breath, the weight of the creature's grip suffocating him. The creature's twisted grin widened as it pulled him closer, its hot, fetid breath washing over him. "Max!" Ellie screamed, her voice breaking through the terror. Max's heart raced as he fought to free himself, but it was hopeless. The creature's strength was far beyond anything he had ever encountered. His body felt like it was being crushed, his lungs fighting for air. But just as Max thought he was done for, the creature paused. A deep, guttural sound emanated from its throat. The same sound it had made when it had first attacked him. The sound of something ancient, something almost familiar. Max's mind raced. What was happening? Why had the creature stopped? And then he understood. The city, the forgotten city beneath the earth, it wasn't just a place. It was alive. And the creatures, they weren't just monsters. They were part of the city. They were its guardians. And now they were aware of him, of Ellie, of their presence. Max's eyes widened in realization. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for their souls. Before he could make sense of what was happening, a low rumble vibrated through the ground beneath him, and the creature's grip loosened, ever so slightly. In that moment of uncertainty, Max swung his leg, kicking the creature with every ounce of strength he had left. The impact sent the creature stumbling backward, but it didn't release him. It merely roared in fury. Max's heart skipped a beat as the ground trembled beneath them, the stone walls vibrating with an ominous hum. Something was changing in the city, something Max couldn't yet understand. "Ellie, get out!" Max screamed one last time, but Ellie stood frozen, her wide eyes locked on the creature, as though unable to tear herself away. Just as the creature's grip tightened again, a series of sharp, unnatural sounds echoed through the chamber. High-pitched screeches, like the sound of something massive and dreadful shifting. The city was waking up. It was alive. Max's world spun as the stone floor beneath him cracked open, sending a deep, rumbling shockwave through the air. The walls began to shift, the ancient symbols glowing brighter with a deep, malevolent energy. The creatures that had remained hidden in the darkness for so long were beginning to emerge. They were no longer just stories or myths, they were real, and they were coming for Max and Ellie. Max could feel the shift in the air, the weight of the city's presence bearing down on them. The creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes flickering in the shadows, their terrible shapes emerging from the dark. Ellie, still trapped in her frozen fear, didn't see them, but Max did. He saw the shape of a creature lurking in the shadows, its claws clicking against the stone. This was it, the end. But then, something changed. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the air. A voice. "Ellie, run!" Max's mind couldn't process the words at first, but then he recognized the voice. It was Sarah. Sarah, the other member of the team. Max's heart pounded in his chest as the familiar voice of Sarah echoed through the crumbling halls. shattering the silence that had descended over the chamber. He couldn't believe it. She was here. But how? The last he had seen of her, she had been lost to the dark, deep within the labyrinthine maze beneath the surface. "Sarah?" Max called out hoarsely, his voice barely more than a whisper as he fought against the creature's grip, now weakening, but still deadly. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the shadows for any sign of his missing team member. "Sarah, where are you?" he yelled again, desperation creeping into his voice. And then, out of the dark, she appeared. Her figure materialized from the shifting shadows, her face pale, her clothes torn, as if she had been through hell. Sarah looked disoriented, her eyes wide and bloodshot, but her gaze quickly focused on Max. "Max! Ellie!" she gasped, her breath shallow, panic clear in her voice. "We need to get out of here. Now." Max's mind raced. It didn't make sense. How had she survived? Why hadn't she come to their aid sooner? And most importantly, how had she found them? "What happened to you?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling, her fear momentarily replaced by concern as she stepped toward Sarah. Sarah shook her head, taking a few hesitant steps forward, her movements slow and labored, as if she had been running for hours. It's not safe here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They're not just monsters. They're something else. Something older. Something worse." The creature, still lurking in the shadows, hissed in response, its glowing eyes narrowing as it took a step forward, its jagged claws scraping against the stone. The low growl echoed through the chamber, sending chills down Max's spine. But Sarah didn't seem to notice. She turned toward Max, her expression darkening as she stepped closer, her hands trembling at her sides. "The city," Sarah began, but her words were cut off as the ground beneath them shook, the walls groaning as if the ancient city itself were waking up. Max's breath caught in his throat as a deafening roar erupted from the depths of the forgotten city. The ground trembled, and from the shadows, more creatures emerged, more monstrous than the one they had already faced. Max's heart raced as his mind struggled to make sense of the chaos around him. These creatures, these abominations, they weren't just mindless beasts. They were intelligent, they were aware, and they were closing in fast. Max turned toward Sarah, his eyes wide with realization. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? What is this place? What have we unleashed?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with terror. "We've awoken them," she whispered, her voice strained. "The city, it's alive, and it's feeding off our fear. The more we struggle, the stronger it gets." Max's mind reeled as he tried to process her words. The city? Alive? Was she talking about the ruins beneath them, or something else entirely? Before he could speak, Ellie cried out in horror. "Max! Look!" Max spun around, his heart stopping as he saw the horrors emerging from the shadows. The creatures were no longer hidden. They were everywhere. Massive, twisted beings with glowing eyes and fangs that dripped with malice. They were the souls of the forgotten, their twisted forms a testament to the ancient city's dark and twisted power. Sarah's face contorted in agony as she looked at the creatures, but she didn't move. She was frozen, paralyzed by the fear that was consuming her. Max knew they didn't have much time. If they didn't act quickly, they would be overwhelmed. He turned to Ellie, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get out. Now." "But the way out," Ellie began, her voice trembling, but Max didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the tunnel that led to the surface. But as they moved, the ground beneath them began to crack, the ancient stone giving way beneath their feet. Max barely had time to react before the earth gave way entirely, and he felt himself plummeting into the depths below. He screamed, reaching out for Ellie, but the darkness swallowed them both. For a moment, everything went black. Max's body slammed against the cold stone floor, the impact knocking the wind out of him. His head spun, his vision blurry, but as he struggled to rise, he felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his leg. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to make sense of where they had landed. "Ellie," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "Ellie, where are you?" Max's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to listen. The echo of his voice was the only sound in the crushing silence that surrounded him. He forced himself to his feet, stumbling as he scanned the darkened cavern. He could hear movement nearby, low, guttural growls, and then, in the distance, he saw a faint glimmer of light. "Ellie," he called out again, more urgently this time, but as he moved toward the light, his breath caught in his throat. There, in the distance, was something that stopped him in his tracks. A figure, a human figure. Max froze, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure turned toward him. It was Ellie, but her eyes were hollow. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open, as if she had seen something unspeakable. And in her hand, she held something dark, something that Max couldn't quite make out. "Ellie?" Max called, his voice trembling. She didn't answer. Max's heart sank as he took a step forward, but before he could get any closer, Ellie turned away from him. She walked deeper into the shadows, her movements stiff and jerky. Max hesitated for only a second before following her. But as he moved closer, the air grew colder. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp around him, and a sense of dread settled over him like a heavy weight. The forgotten city was alive, and it was waiting for him.